If you want to understand Weimar Germany and its importance when looking at the modern world, one of the first things you have to really grasp is how people lived in print, particularly in newspapers and magazines. My name's Jason Collings, and I write the Alaric von Trello mysteries. I spend a lot of my time looking at Weimar Germany and its culture and its society and obviously its history. And the people who lived through that period, particularly in Berlin, were not just informed by newsprint or entertained by it, they lived in it. It was essential to them culturally. They woke up to newspapers, they argued through newspapers, they travelled with them folded under their arms, sat in cafes, behind papers, they read them on the trams and on the trains. They made their decisions about who they voted for through the newspapers. Their anxieties came through the newspapers. They learned to hate each other or found their tribe through papers. And Berlin in particular was a city that seemed to rustle with the paper. Um, there were kiosks everywhere, billboards, the evening editions, the paper boys and paper girls yelling out the headlines. There were illustrated weeklies, party papers, satirical journals, scandal sheets, cultural reviews, financial papers, the provincials, women's magazines, sports papers, race papers, trade press. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of newspapers, periodicals published every week, every month. And there was always something new out. There was always something new to read, always some fresh news, some new outrage, whether it was a murder, political accusations, assassinations, sex scandals, economic alarms, some new certainty about what was ruining Germany and what the next disaster would be, and also what to do about it and who was to blame. And in that, it's very, very familiar. It feels very much like social media. There was a density of newspapers and magazines and periodicals in Weimar Germany, particularly in Berlin, that you don't see in any other culture, any other nation of the period, and really only comes around again once we get social media. And I think that's one of the keys to understanding Weimar Germany, but also to understanding its importance to us now from a cultural perspective. People often talk as though the Republic was destroyed by inflation and Versailles and the coming of Hitler and the Nazis and street violence, and all of these things are true to a point. But there is another layer to it, a psychologically important one that I think in many ways is more important than a lot of those others. And that was that the daily mental environment in which millions of Germans lived was fundamentally oppressive and causing them anxiety because of the press. Weimar Germany did not just have a free press, it had an overexcited, tribalized, hyper competitive press culture that made public life faster, dirtier, more polarized, and more on edge than it should otherwise have been. And that mattered because once a society starts to experience itself as one long rolling emergency, that people promising calm compromise and procedure and democratic patience start to sound feeble. They start to sound idiotic. How are you going to stop this cascade of chaos just by having a vote? It just seems absurd. Whereas the people promising force and clarity and having clear ideas of all you have to do is this and it's these people who are to blame, they start to sound tempting. If all you get every day is panic and bad news and disaster and warnings of new things that are coming that will be even worse, you start to think the unthinkable. The extreme becomes acceptable because everything else seems to have failed and continue to fail because that's what you're being told is happening. And that's the story here. The first thing that you have to understand is the volume of papers. So Germany had been a newspaper society before 1914, and Weimar inherited that, but it then expanded it. Berlin was one of the newspaper capitals of the world. The big publishing houses were incredibly influential. Ullstein, Moss, Scholl, later Hugenberg's expanding empire shaped not just what people read, but how they read, the rhythm, the visual shock, the entire experience of consuming the news. And this wasn't just one press speaking with a single voice. This was a free press writ large. It was a whole shouting marketplace. Liberal papers, conservative papers, Catholic papers, socialist papers, communist papers, nationalist papers, respectable bourgeois papers for men who like to think of themselves as serious men, loud tabloids for those who liked some sensation with their coffee. There were papers who told you Germany has to reconcile itself with reality. Those that said that Germany had been stabbed in the back and betrayed. There were papers for workers, papers for businessmen, papers for women, moviegoers, people who wanted to feel informed, people who wanted to feel furious, people who just wanted to have a laugh. And a number of them managed to do all of these at once, or at least a lot of them at once. And this is really important to understand because the newspapers of the Weimar era were not simply carriers of information, they were communities. They told you where you belonged. As I said, they defined your tribe. They told you who you were because you were part of their tribe. And who are we? We are this. If you are this, you are part of us. They made you feel that you belonged. And again, this is very like social media. And in doing that, in saying where you belonged, they then defined who you weren't, who your enemies were, who was to blame for the trouble and the problems. Was it the left or the right, the Jews or the immigrants or whoever? And it gave you a language to use. It framed a lexicon for describing your who you were and who your opponents were, what emotions were appropriate, how events could be framed. A man buying the Berliner Tagblatt wasn't just buying a bundle of paper with some information. He was buying into a certain tone of liberal, intelligent, metropolitan seriousness. And if you saw a man carrying the Berliner Tagblatt, you knew that that man was that type of man. It defined him more than the clothes he wore and the hat he had on his head. Someone reading the Vossische Zeitung was inhabiting a world of established bourgeois culture, civic self-respect. A committed social democrat would be reading Vorwärts. And if you saw a man reading Vorwärts, the word means forwards. It was the newspaper of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. You knew that this was a committed political man. A communist would be reading Die Rote Fahne, the red flag. And again, by seeing that newspaper, you knew who they were. You could define who they were just by seeing their newspaper. If you were sliding to the right and were a nationalist, there were papers for you there as well. And they would reflect your ideas, your grievances, your language. They would tutor you, sharpen you, give you the information you need to think in a particular way. And they would define your thought and start to channel it. Again, like social media, before algorithms existed, they were already shaping public opinion and thinking. And because there were so many papers, one of the most striking things about Weimar print culture is how those niches could become so small, how tiny those worldviews could shrink without ever feeling lonely. There is a psychological truth that you only need 12 people to reflect an idea for it to feel normalized. And this is fine if you're living in a small village or even in a tribal environment, because if you claim that the world is run by lizards in skin suits, everyone around you is going to say you're crazy. And this will get through and you'll go, yeah, okay, that's probably not the case. But we see in the modern age with such ideas as QAnon and other conspiracy theories that on the internet you can always find 12 people who will go, yeah, that makes sense. Lizards running the world? Yeah, sure. You know, there's conspiracies going on in pizza parlor basements. Yeah, absolutely fine. There's 12 people telling me that's true. The same was happening in Weimar Germany. You could always find a newspaper and a community and a group for whatever your particular brand of politics or interests or craziness was. So if you were anti-Semitic, hyper-nationalist, anti-Republican, anti-Marxist, Catholic, anti-Catholic, proletarian revolutionary, ultra-conservative, monarchist, didn't matter. There was a paper for you and a community behind it that made you feel welcomed and rational and reasonable and told you everybody else was the problem. That had enormous consequences. And these are consequences we should be able to recognize today and hopefully maybe take some warnings from. Because once people stop merely disagreeing and start living inside those separate systems, they start to fragment. Society starts to develop real fault lines. Different Germans were no longer arguing over the same event. They were receiving the event through different emotional machines, different lenses. The same thing was being seen in a completely different way, being interpreted in a completely different way. And they were reacting emotionally in a completely different way. Let's take the party press as an example. This is where Weimar politics begins to look startlingly modern, particularly if we are looking through the lens of modern German politics or American politics or British politics. Party papers didn't simply cover politics. They rehearsed it, organized it, moralized it. They transformed political identity into something daily and habitual. A social democrat reading Vorwärts didn't only vote SPD now and then, they inhabited an SPD informational world. A communist would do the same, and so on through the other political parties. Public life became less a common forum where everybody had the same information and made their own judgments, and more a battlefield of printed realities seen through particular lenses. And if politics could be lived through the press, then the press became one of the places where Germany's enemies were defined. And that's where the emotional language really matters. You begin to notice, once you look at the Weimar press properly, how much it rewarded not just conviction, but temperature. A man who said, "This is worrying and complex," didn't sell like a man who said, "This is filth, betrayal, collapse, treachery, and outrage." And newspapers are businesses as well as organs of opinion. And in Weimar, they were operating in a hugely crowded market where attention was scarce. Again, so like the modern news cycle, so like social media, outrage sells. You have to have the new piece of news. And this has been the case since 24-hour news began, and even before. You see it in movies like Network from the 1970s. But we had this in Weimar Germany, this constant need for the latest outrage, for the next thing to be more outrageous, to sell more papers, because moderation didn't sell. Restraint didn't sell. If you wanted circulation, you needed something sharper, something outrageous, something horrific to make people stop and look, because they were becoming inured, they were becoming sated, dulled, apathetic, and you needed to keep the machine going. So the system nudged itself step by step by step towards greater and greater sensationalism. More crime, more blood, more vice, more scandal, more political theatre, more sex, more panic, more of everything. And if there was a murder, it had to be made vivid. If there was some sex scandal, it had to be utterly salacious. If there was a parliamentary crisis, it had to be framed as evidence that the whole machinery of the Weimar Republic was rotten and hopeless. And this started to be believed. It started to be fed through. You get within crime reporting, you get the whole idea of Mordlust, this lust for murder, which is created. You get the sensationalization of serial killers, which, yes, there were serial killers, but fundamentally, these were horribly disturbed men, many of whom had come out of the horror of the trenches. And their minds were completely screwed up. It would have been remarkable if you hadn't have had men who had come out of that kind of industrial slaughter who hadn't unfortunately carried on and killed. But it was churned into this horrific idea that there were murderers around every corner, that strange foreign looking fellow over there, that could be the latest serial killer. And this created a climate of fear, a climate of hopelessness and anxiety and despair. It wasn't excitement anymore. It was emotional weather of the stormiest kind. A reader marinating every day in scandal and catastrophe and accusation and crisis doesn't come out neutral. They don't just walk away and go, oh, that was interesting. They begin to feel that the whole society is broken, that public life is filthy and unstable and sliding towards ruin. The media world of Weimar, encapsulated in newspapers, since radio was in its infancy and television didn't exist yet, and whilst there was quite a lot of movies, fundamentally they were mainly there for entertainment at this stage rather than information. The newspaper world conveyed to Berliners and to Germans in general that the nation wasn't simply in difficulty, it was in a state of disgrace and verging on collapse constantly. And they had seen collapse. They had seen the end of the war, 1918 into 19, the revolutions. They had seen the economic collapse of 1923 with hyperinflation. It could happen. And they kept being told, the next one's just around the corner. It's just coming. And there's nothing the politicians can do, and they're involved in the latest sex scandal or whatever. And look, you know it's all going horribly wrong because there's been another horrific murder. And so it gave the sense that everything was awful, everything was broken and dangerous and betrayal. And in that atmosphere, the moderates suffer. They find it impossible to find an audience, because moderation is never at its best when the market is in panic. Coalitions and procedure and compromise starts to look absurd. And as people drift apart, their willingness to cross those gaps, to reach over and take someone else's hand despite their differences, becomes less and less and less. And a republic trying to govern through law and parliamentary bargaining starts to look weak. It looks ridiculous, even contemptible, particularly through the lens of this disparate, factionalized media. And that's one of the ways that the press helped prepare the ground for extremism, to fertilize it, to make it happen. Not because every paper was secretly Nazi, because of course they were. Many of them were desperately opposed to Nazism. But because they created an environment where extremism became the only real option, because a public trained to experience life as one long chain of shocks is easier to convince that the old parties have failed, that democracies failed, the republics failed, and the country now needs not moderation and coalition and patience, but force and strength and decision. And it needs an emergency measure because it's constantly in a state of emergency. And to have that emergency measure, it needs a strong man to lead it. And this is the Weimar pattern. They were taking steps towards extremism and authoritarianism because it seemed to be the only thing that made sense. Then there is the sheer glamour of print itself. Weimar was not only political, it was very visual. The illustrated press mattered hugely. Papers and magazines didn't merely tell readers what had happened, they showed it in the most modern technicolor way. And remember that this is a period where there is no color television, no television at all, and no color film. Color only comes in print. So the color magazines were incredibly important. There were the layouts were dynamic. There were photographs, some black and white, obviously, but not color photographs, but there were certainly color prints. Advertising, brightly colored, became more aggressive. The city began to see itself in print as glamorous, vivacious, stylish. The Berliner Illustratzeitung is the obvious example of mass market, image heavy, modern in a way that feels very contemporary. It didn't just report Weimar Germany, it helped teach readers how to consume the culture. Celebrity and crime and sport and fashion, these were its bread and butter. All of it flattened into the same urgent field of attention, that what you had to have was more, and it had to be brighter, and it had to be more exciting. And this exacerbated what was going on in the daily newspapers. Weimar Germany wasn't just reading more, it was being trained to experience and consume as a stream of oversensitized stimuli. And once you have that, the next step isn't really hard to imagine. Politics starts being something solemn and considered that you think about and you look at all the different options. It starts to become not only tribal, but almost an entertainment economy. Not harmless, but recognizably, it has characters, villains, heroes, reveals, scandals, secrets, shocks, and twists. Almost like a telenovela. And that helped the Nazis enormously because they understood performance. Hitler, the great orator, Goebbels, the great propagandist, and there were others. But before coming to them, it's worth looking at the big press empires and their role in trying to shape public opinion from above. Hugo Stinnes, the great inflation king of the early 20s, was the first of these great figures. He's one of those men who help explain why Weimar always felt like a republic living among forces larger than itself. Industrial magnate, coal, steel, shipping, electricity, paper. He didn't merely own productive industry. He understood media as power as well. He acquired newspapers because newspapers shaped political climate in which industry and labour relations and policy would be decided. And that was an important Weimar lesson. The industrialists, the rich, came to understand that media concentration gave them power. And so they started to buy up the newspapers. And Stinnes was the first of these, but by no means the last. The most powerful of these was Alfred Hugenberg, who, after Stinnes' death in 1924, went even further. Hugenberg built a huge conservative nationalist media empire. He took over the Schul publishing house and used press and film as instruments of ideological pressure. He was the leading financier of the right-wing nationalist DNVP political party, which allied with the Nazis, helped to put them in power. And his newspaper empire played a huge part in that. These papers continually trumpeted republicanism, nationalism, the myth of the stab in the back legend, anti-Semitism, grievance, anti-Versailles. And they railed against any politician who didn't back their ideas. And then you come to the Nazis themselves, who were by no means the only users of media manipulation, but they were among its most gifted and relentless. And what they understood, and understood very early, was that a movement needs not only doctrine, but repetition, branding, rhythm, and community. And it needs it in a printed environment. The Volkische Beobachter was the flagship newspaper of the Nazi Party, the ideological centre of gravity, but it was only one of a number of papers. There was also the Angriff, Goebbels' Berlin paper. It mattered because it was urban, aggressive, and very immediate, full of combativeness, written for the street fighters of politics. Then there was Der Stürmer, Julius Streicher's poisonous anti-Semitic, hideous paper. It was really a gutter. It specialized in humiliation, a pornography of hatred, and it repeated over and over again this normalization of these anti-Semitic, anti-homosexual, chauvinistic, nationalistic myths and fantasies. And this is important, that they didn't have a series of papers that were all the same. They had registers. One paper gave doctrine, another gave street aggression, another gave this horrible, almost pornographic emotional charge of hatred. And together they built an ecosystem. Whoever you were, whatever background you came from, whether you were educated, whether you were not, whether you were aggressive, whether you were more of an intellectual, you could find something in there that would speak to you in your language and convey the message. Goebbels, especially in Berlin, grasped the tempo of modern media brilliantly. He understood that it wasn't enough to be right in one's own eyes. You had to be present, constant, theatrical, and impossible to ignore. And the press could be used to generate a sense that the movement was surging, even if it wasn't. He understood that the story was more important than the truth, that if you could tell a lie, particularly a big lie, and tell it often enough, it didn't matter whether it was reality or not. And that's a very modern instinct, and it worked brilliantly. But let's not only blame the openly vicious publication. One of Weimar's deeper problems was that the respectable press wasn't always respectable. The big publications often would position themselves to publish extreme stories simply to get readers to buy it, simply to make sure that they remained on top and engaged. And by dragging themselves down and lowering themselves to that level, they contributed to the general sense of dislocation and fragmentation in the political and social society. There was also crime, of course, and we've touched on this. But Weimar's press loved crime. It could hardly do otherwise. Berlin was a big city, and big, anonymous, and nervous enough to make crime stories feel like revelations and that there was a murderer behind every lamppost. Again, the point, it wasn't simply that people read these things, it was then in reading them, they helped to exacerbate the public mood, to gain the feel that this was an environment that was constantly hostile. And that sensation that the country was unrecognizable, indecent, impossible to control, became politically potent. If you feel that there are people going to kill you, lurking around every corner, like the modern stories that London is awash with youths trying to stab you, Well, I wander through London, most weeks, sometimes every day, and nobody's tried to stab me. I've only ever seen an attempt at knife crime once in 50 years in the city. But if you look at the media, you'd think it was happening on every street corner. And it's exactly the same thing happening in Germany in the 1920s and particularly into the 1930s. So, yes, Weimar Germany had a free press in a formal sense, but freedom alone didn't guarantee health. That's one of the real lessons of the period, and one that we really ought to be listening to. Free press is important, it's vital, but a society can be information rich and wisdom poor at the same time. It can have plural voices, but they can become claustrophobic and drive each other to destruction. It can enjoy a freedom of press, but still watch truth dissolve into tribal fragmentation and a sense of certainty and permanent outrage that drives society and politics towards a destructive end. And that's what happened in Weimar's storm of paper. The Republic didn't simply lose arguments, it lost emotional control of the public mood. The papers kept turning the temperature up because they needed to sell more and because their bosses, many of whom were the rich who wanted to control the agenda, drove them to do it. And the people, driven by the tribalism created by these papers, became more and more fragmented, more and more scared of their neighbors, more and more scared of anyone who didn't think like them or look like them or talk like them, and more inclined to think that the Republic had failed and that the only solution was a strong autocratic government led by a strong man that could save them from the horror that they read about every day. Thanks very much. Subscribe for more.